It feels like it's been ages since we got a new top-end SixZero paddle, but they are definitely back now with two brand new paddles, the Black Opal and the Ruby Pro. Today we're going to review the Ruby Pro. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So I know there's been a ton of excitement regarding these new SixZero paddles, especially the Black Opal, which is coming soon, and I will get that review out as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get my hands on an early sample. Hopefully that's something that can change with future releases. But we did get the Ruby Pro a few weeks ago, and I know it's not as exciting as the Black Opal, or at least it doesn't sound as exciting, but it's a great paddle in its own right. So I'm gonna get right into the review and talk about all the cool tech that's going on in here. But first, let me remind you that any of the paddles I talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So I'm quickly going to read out the specs before I get into the tech, and the Ruby Pro is the logical evolution of the Ruby, I guess you could say. It's a 16.3-inch hybrid paddle with a 5.5-inch handle, a 14mm core, and it weighs between 8 and 8.3 ounces. There's no 16mm option, at least not yet, and I'm not sure why. But then the twist weight is 6.26 and the swing weight is 113. The reason I say it's the logical successor to the Ruby isn't just because of the shape and the name. Despite this having a black top sheet, it actually is aramid fiber, or as we know it better, Kevlar. For those of you who don't know, Kevlar is just a brand name for aramid fiber, kind of like Kleenex and facial tissues. Anyways, the aramid fiber is the first top sheet material, but on top of that, SixZero have added what they're calling diamond tuff. This is some sort of diamond particle dust that massively increases the face's texture and should theoretically also increase durability. Diamonds are extremely durable after all. This is super cool. I don't know the cost associated with that, but it can't be too high because this isn't a crazy expensive paddle, but it is really cool innovation, and I can tell you right now, this is one of the grittiest paddles I've ever tested. Below that, there's a sheet of some sort of material that hasn't been disclosed by SixZero. They are generally a pretty secretive company, but I'm sure we'll figure that out one day. And then below that, there's one last sheet of carbon. Now they're using a different weave pattern on this paddle. Most brands weave at 90-degree angles. SixZero is weaving this top sheet at a 45-degree angle, which is supposed to increase dwell time and spin potential. More on that later. Finally, before we talk about the core, SixZero has sandwiched between the core and those top sheets a layer of what they call power gel. I'm not sure exactly what kind of material it is, but it's a quote-unquote dynamic material that's there to increase power and pop. Now moving on to the core, and as you can see from the impacts I've made here, this is a honeycomb core, but this honeycomb actually has a larger 12mm cell size. Bigger cells are meant to increase dwell time and just generally make the paddle softer and pocket the ball a bit better. This is sort of comparable to a denser versus a more open string bed in a tennis racket if you want to look at it that way. Denser cells, like denser string beds, are firmer, they can feel a bit harsh, and they concentrate the sweet spot into a smaller area. Wider cells just open everything up, and I'll talk about how that impacts playability in a second. But so far, most of the technology here is designed to increase dwell time and ball pocketing, which is really cool. That's what Gen 3s and Gen 4s do. This is just a different way of doing that. Now bear with me, we're not quite done with the tech yet. Surrounding the core, there's a perimeter carbon and foam outer layer, and then finally there's some silicone injected into the handle for extra vibration dampening. Now this perimeter foam is not the same foam we get in Gen 3. So yes, this is technically a Gen 2, or I guess a Gen 2 adjacent paddle, I guess you could say, but don't let that make you shy away from this. This is a great paddle. All this tech in here actually makes it work very well as a package. So let's move on to playability now, and we're gonna start with feel. So first of all, I just want to say it's nice to have honeycomb back. I love full foam cores, don't get me wrong, and I know that honeycomb has its flaws, but there's also no denying that it provides such a clean, crisp feel for the ball, especially compared to the more muted feel of foam. Now this isn't your standard honeycomb core either. This paddle is very unique, and the word that keeps coming back to mind is dynamic. This paddle provides a different sensation at different swing speeds. Before I get into detail about that though, the one thing that remains constant for any type of shot is that this is a very responsive paddle. There's no ambiguousness to the feel despite it being dynamic. Sometimes these dynamic paddles are hard to understand because they react so differently to different types of shots. You look at Gen 3s, especially the original super springy Gen 3s, those paddles are dynamic, but there's so much extra going on during ball pocketing, which makes them harder to master. Here, there is a different feel on different shots, but the responsiveness is there the whole time. What you put in is what you get out without the paddle taking over too much. Hopefully that makes sense. Now I'm gonna start with describing the feel it has on faster shots because I really like it. When you hit the ball with a lot of paddle head speed, it has a pretty long dwell time, especially for a 14mm thermoform paddle that doesn't have a lot of foam in its construction. It's obviously not as long as the dwell time you'll get with softer Gen 4s and most Gen 3s, but it's much longer than a standard Gen 2 and even some stiffer Gen 4s. Now what's really cool here is that it has an extended dwell time, but there's not really any spring effect. Instead of that reboundy, almost bouncy feel of a Gen 3, this is more of a chalky feel. It adds a little bit of power during pocketing, but here it's more like a slingshot. You can almost grab and throw the ball yourself rather than the paddle doing that for you. I love this sensation. I think it's really cool, especially because it gives you more control on power shots. You have that extra time, but you're not nearly as worried about overhitting. I was wondering if brands could figure out a way of adding dwell time without adding too much spring effect. Gen 4s do that to a certain extent, at least the less powerful ones, but this really is the first time I feel it on a paddle with a honeycomb core, and I just love the feedback I get with honeycomb. Now speaking of that feedback, yes it's a honeycomb core, and yes it's responsive, but it's actually fairly dampened for a Gen 2 thermoform paddle. There's a lot of dampening stuff in here, especially that silicone in the handle. It definitely mutes out a lot of those vibrations. I think they could have done without it, but it's certainly not over the top muted. This is still a very connected, crisp feeling paddle, and combining that with more dwell time is really cool, and it feels like the logical evolution of the Ruby, which was one of the first dynamic Gen 2s thanks to the Kevlar. Kevlar adds more dwell time than carbon, but this takes that concept to a whole different level, and I think a lot of people are gonna like this feel. Now so far, I've only been talking about how it feels on fast shots. When you're hitting slower touch shots, you definitely don't get as much dwell time. You get less of that chalky feel. This is where the paddle feels more like a standard Gen 2, I guess you could say. It's not bad, but it is quite firm. And that makes sense. The harder you hit, the deeper the ball crushes into the paddle, and the more you're gonna feel the effects of that technology. But I do wish I could get a little bit more of that dwell time on soft shots. Having said that, I want to make one thing very clear. You don't have to generate that much paddle head speed to start getting that plusher chalky feel. It's not like you only get it on big drives or on serves or whatever. It does not take much to start feeling that ball sinking into the paddle face. Once I got used to the Ruby Pro, I started actively trying to increase my paddle head speed even on touch shots just so I could get that extra dwell time, and it actually worked pretty well. What I would do is on drops, resets, instead of guiding the ball into the kitchen with this motion and a really locked wrist, I would try to caress the ball a little bit more. That's maybe not the ideal technique to use in the touch game, but if it works, it works. And there's another thing you can do to try and increase that dwell time, adding weight. Unfortunately, it's been pouring rain in Vancouver, so I haven't actually tried this, but theoretically it should work, and I'll make a little update to that in my Black Opal review. But anyways, the feel here overall is excellent. SixZero clearly tried something new and it works very well. This is a crisp honeycomb paddle with exceptional dwell time. It's a breath of fresh air for me to use something like this. I've been really waiting for a brand to make a honeycomb paddle with a long dwell time that isn't springy, and this is exactly that. I do wish they had it in a 16mm option, but they don't. Hopefully that comes one day. Now the next thing we do need to talk about is sweet spot size. Now in terms of sweet spot size, you have to understand, this is a Gen 2 14mm honeycomb paddle with some very innovative technology, but you can't expect it to have a massive sweet spot like we've become accustomed to with Gen 4s. I just don't think it's physically possible for a paddle like this to have as big a sweet spot, and it's definitely not. It's noticeably smaller than a lot of the paddles I've been testing recently. That's the trade-off you make with a honeycomb core. You sacrifice some sweet spot to get an overall more crisp and connected feel in the sweet spot. You definitely do feel that drop off in playability on off-center hits though, and I brought out a Genesis to compare because I think you have to make that comparison, and it's undeniably bigger on that paddle. But with that out of the way, the Ruby Pro has a very impressive sweet spot for the type of paddle that it is. What I mean is that compared to any other Gen 2 thermoform paddle, it is noticeably bigger, and that's thanks to this wider cell honeycomb core. It does a really good job of opening up that face to make it plusher and more forgiving on off-center hits. Again, not as much as foam, but more than on any Gen 2 I've used. Of course, adding weight to the sides will help expand it even more, and that's where, if you're fine doing that, stock sweet spot performance matters a lot less, so definitely give customization a go. But anyways, I hope I made the whole feel and sweet spot experience very clear. Understanding that is key to understanding how this paddle performs in terms of power, spin, control, and all that, and that's what we're gonna talk about now, starting with spin. Spin is by far the most impressive performance characteristic on the Ruby Pro. It has elite spin, and I felt that as soon as I hit my first serve. The extended dwell time combined with this extremely gritty top sheet grabs onto the ball so effectively, it almost feels like you have a cheese grater in your hand, and you can see all the ball residue here. That's a whole different conversation, how it actually destroys the ball, but in terms of performance, it really is quite phenomenal for spin, and I had such a fun time trying to push it to its limits. I was letting loose and hitting as hard as I wanted with confidence that spin was going to bring the ball down before the baseline. I can't even count how many big drives I hit here, but you can see from the on-court footage just how great it is. Now, of course, it is still a hybrid paddle, so it doesn't have quite the same leverage for spin as elongated paddles. That just means it's a bit of a different experience. It's less penetrative spin, more loopy spin, but either way, it's amazing, and it's by far the most spin-friendly SixZero paddle I've used so far. It's also the level of control you have over spin that's so impressive to me because of that dwell time. It's not like older Gen 2s and even some firmer Gen 4s where the ball's just in and out of the paddle face so quickly that you can't really feel the spin you're putting onto the ball. You can modulate your spin so well here because it spends longer in the paddle face, and as you can imagine, having that level of control over your spin isn't just good for powerful shots, it's also great for soft spin. I said it earlier, you don't need a ton of swing speed to tap into that dwell time, so even when you do slow it down and go for a spinny drop, you still have that exceptional control over your spin. Again, I was pushing the limits here. I hit some crazy low dipping passing shots where instead of punching through the ball, I brushed up to get it to land earlier, and executing that shot properly makes it almost impossible to return. There are very few paddles that do as good of a job at modulating soft spin as this Ruby Pro does. Even Gen 3s, which I think are amazing for those shots, they're harder to control because of the spring effect. With those, you really need to focus on not hitting too hard. Here, you've got the dwell time without as much of the risk factor. It's not going to surprise you by overpowering a spinny drop. You can overpower a spinny drop, but it'll be your fault, not the paddle's fault. Well, is it ever really the paddle's fault? Now that's also where this hybrid shape is elite. This paddle is so easy to quickly pronate through that windshield wiper motion you use to produce spin, and that just adds to its easy spin I keep talking about. Same story up at the net. You can take a low ball and still shape it enough to have it land before the baseline, which is such an important characteristic to have in a paddle because it gives you the confidence to go for those shots. Look at this clip. I had a ball bounce right around the kitchen, and with most paddles I'd probably dink it because I'm not confident hitting a full spin shot would land in from there, but that's what I did, and sure enough it hit the line. So yeah, just phenomenal performance in the spin game. It really is a special paddle in that regard, beyond just having good spin stats. I think that's what's really important to emphasize here. Not all paddles that have high spin stats give you this level of confidence in the spin game. Now moving on to power, for those of you who were hoping that this would be one of those insanely powerful point-ending paddles, it's not. But that's not what it was designed to do. Remember, this paddle doesn't have a trampoline effect. There's no springy EVA foam in here, so it's never going to be competitive with the most powerful paddles in the industry. But again, with that said, the power is still great, and it's going to be more than enough for most people, and I really mean that. I never found myself missing power. It goes back to what I was saying about this feeling a bit like a slingshot. You feel like you can almost grab the ball and launch it the same way you do when you're throwing a ball. Of course, it's way more subtle than that, but that's the sensation it gives you. And if anything, from the baseline, because I'm not scared of overpowering it and I'm so confident in its spin, I can actually swing more freely myself. For those of you who naturally generate a lot of power, it's going to perform great on drives, on serves, whatever big powerful shot you want to hit, it's certainly not going to hold you back. Now pop is also great, and that's because of how responsive this paddle is. If you're hitting a slice volley, for example, not one where you're taking a big cut of the ball, it redirects that pace very efficiently. Of course, if you do swing at the ball on a volley, that's where the extra dwell time kicks in and you get a little bit of extra punch there, so it's also great. I had a very easy time putting the ball away up at the net. That maneuverability is also a real asset up there. It's just a split second faster to react with. Now, the one area where it's a little lacking in terms of power is when you're in a hands battle and you're just reacting without any time to add any power yourself. This is where it could do with some more inherent pop to compete with the most powerful Gen 3s and Gen 4s, and that's also where the smaller sweet spot is a bit of a drawback. But overall, the power profile is great. It's confidence inducing, and it will be more than enough for the majority of players. Control is definitely this paddle's weakest characteristic. There's nothing here that really helps you in the super soft control game, especially when you compare it to Gen 4s nowadays, which are so elite for control. The main problem for me is that on really soft touch shots, you don't get the same dwell time you have when you swing harder. It's a much more raw sensation on touch shots, and I'm talking really soft control shots. That's why I was saying earlier that I started trying to add some swing speed to my touch shots. That's easy enough to do with drops when you're away from the kitchen. You can hit a spinny drop, or you can add a little bit more slice, anything like that that's going to help you crush into the ball a little more. You can almost force dwell time out of the paddle. At the kitchen, that's a lot harder just because the ball doesn't have to travel very far, so you don't have to put a lot of force on it. And it's not bad for dinking, it's just very standard. Where I struggled most for control though was with resets, especially on those resets where the ball I was receiving was bouncing right in front of me. You don't have very much time to react to the ball in that situation. It's a very instinctive shot, so you really have to trust the paddle because you're not going to be able to generate anything yourself. That's also kind of like with speed ups. When you really want your paddle to have a big sweet spot, that combination of softness and sweet spot like you get on a Gen 4 is what makes those so elite for resets. You have neither with this paddle, so it does feel a bit inconsistent, or at least it doesn't make that part of the game any easier. And as you can see here, I got into some situations where I was pinned back, and I was never fully confident that I could hit balls back into the kitchen for days. This is where adding weight to the sides would help it immensely, and I actually think that's exactly what this paddle needs to make it more well-rounded. So again, I will provide an update to that as soon as possible. But don't get the Ruby Pro expecting it to be the greatest control paddle of all time. And I don't think that looking at it, 14 millimeters, Gen 2 construction, that anyone was really thinking that, so that's fine with me. Now this paddle is interesting to me because I guess on paper what I've said is that the control isn't elite, power is great but nowhere near the top, and spin is amazing but a lot of other paddles are spin friendly. So what's the point? Well, what's so great about this paddle is the intangible stuff. It's that unique feel that's very difficult to quantify, but it provides some of the best feedback, the best ball pocketing, and just generally a very responsive playing experience. This really is a paddle made for someone who wants to feel the ball, who doesn't want any surprises, but also wants something that's not limited in the important parts of what pickleball has become. It absolutely can hold its own in power and spin, and the good thing is, once you've developed that trust in this paddle by dialing it in thanks to its amazing feel, you will be confident in the control game. Especially if you take the time to customize it to a spec you're comfortable with. This is a special paddle for those of you who prioritize feel over anything else. It's also worth pointing out that this is one of the quickest paddles around right now because it's a 14 millimeter hybrid with a fairly low swing weight, and that quick hand speed is something I know a lot of players love. So I think this paddle will probably fly under the radar a little bit, especially compared to the Black Opal, which I assume will have some much louder overall playability. But it's also one of those paddles that I think if people give it a shot, they're gonna absolutely love it. I'm actually gonna keep hitting with it. I like it that much, and I'm really excited to compare it to the Black Opal, which I should be getting soon. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, if you want to demo the SixZero Ruby Pro, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy it, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.